as you know, I've been doing this work for several years, and it's always gives me joy when I see people who are struggling make small changes, and changes, especially with emotional health, cannot come quickly. It's a process and it's a journey.
Absolutely.
So tell me, we see in our field people that come with the trauma, with addiction, and so what goes really on in the brain? I understand, we have a lower brain, which is our reptilian brain, and then there's the midbrain, which is the emotional brain, and then of course our prefrontal cortex, which is our executive brain. I hope we all are using that. But so share with us. Often I know that we tend to use our lower parts of brain, which is the fight and flight response or reactive response. Share with the audience what really happens to the brain when we are making certain choices in life.
Sure. Well, if I can start with maybe this simple model, the hand brain model, and this is a model that was created by Dr. Dan Siegel, who's a medical doctor and a professor down at the University of Southern California. And if I can just show that perhaps my arm would be the spinal cord and the brain stem, and that my hand is the brain. Now, there's another doctor, Paul MacLean, and he created this model called the Triune Brain, and that just basically means 3 levels, okay? And so if I use the palm of my hand as this sort of what's called the reptilian brain, right? And that consists of sort of 3 areas, the pons, the midbrain, and the medulla. And then my thumb would be the limbic system, and that's often called the mammalian brain, right? And this is primarily organized around the interpretation and management of emotions, okay? And then the 3rd layer of the brain, the newest layer of the brain that separates us from most everything else on this planet, is the gray matter, the white matter, the cortex. And predominantly, if I were to say this part of my fingers right here, the knuckles and the nails, is the prefrontal cortex. And this is the area that we talk about in terms of executive function. So when you and I are talking right now in this particular fashion, or if we create scenarios, imagine things, look at different possible outcomes, as far as we know, we're unique in this area, that we can do this. Now, part of the challenge arises for people that are struggling with anything, be it addiction, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, is that in the way that we're talking now, we are functioning in this holistic way where the brain is integrated and connected and operating optimally. When we experience trauma, what will happen is that this brain, these 2 layers, will come offline, now either a little or a lot, right? And for example, we've evolved such that the parts of the brain, this reptilian part of the brain, will take over if we have to jump out of the way of a falling tree, or run from a bear or a saber-toothed tiger, or jump out of the way of a snake. And it releases these particular chemicals that make us stronger, faster, more alert. And they're called enkephalins and adrenalins, noradrenalins, okay? And these chemicals are wonderful at doing something in the short term like that. But this is now one of the interesting parts of this brain is it primarily controls the sort of baser functions, so heart rate, temperature fluctuation, all kinds of things like that, digestion. It doesn't do a terribly good job with sophisticated concepts. So it's more of a black or white, all or nothing, 0 or 100 kind of functioning in how it does things. And as I say, this is great when there's something extreme going on. But one of the interesting components of this is this part of the brain doesn't really know the difference very well between the real and the imagined. So when we'll have a trauma, and it can be something like that, or it can be a social trauma, right? Where we're the recipients of physical abuse, psychological abuse, or sexual abuse. And it can be extreme in that nature, or it can be less extreme. Right? And there's sort of 2 types of traumas. There's explicit, which is the kind that you have a memory for, and implicit, which you may have not had a memory of at all because you were too young, or that you've kind of forgotten it. And those kinds of things can glom together. Now, because this part of the brain doesn't really know the difference between the real and the imagined, if a trauma does not get processed, grieved, and mourned, and realized, it will stay in the mind and in the body. And when that happens, instead of the brain being fully aligned and functioning in this way, it's offline perhaps just a little. And this part of the brain releases chemicals, like I say, the noradrenalines, the adrenalines, and enkephalins, that can be quite problematic for the body if it's going on chronically, and it wears the body down. When this is also happening, the executive function, this gray matter part of our brain, it doesn't operate in this optimal way where it's doing most of the controlling and sending information from the top down. So there's a significant change in how the brain should be functioning. And when this happens, people will struggle. When people have trauma and it's not processed and not worked through, then this system is going on, either a little or a lot, depending on the degree, but it results in people being, for example, they'll stay in a cycle of stuckness, and it leads people to being very susceptible, for example, to drug abuse or alcohol abuse or substance abuse, because of the particular profile of the trauma.